It's me, the return of the disheveled goblin host. No more shall imposters take on the news. It shall be me, the disheveled goblin.
Until my dying day.
That was a little too much. That was a little over the top. I'm sorry. It's just after Murph and Tim did such a good job of hosting the fantasy news, and they used these big blades and stuff, I'm feeling a little insecure, you know? You guys really seem to like them, and it's like, I hope you still love me. But hey, that's the only thing that bothered me. Not also the comment where they said Murph is using real blades while Daniel only uses prop ones. Excuse me. My blades be real. You wanna know how reckless I would be if I was using prop blades? And in case that's going to get me demonetized YouTube, they're totally not real blades. Also, I took years of fencing and was a Boy Scout, so you know, I have experience with them. Please, for the love of God, there's a reason I'm safe and still a lot of the time with the blades. It's not like I've ever put one in my mouth. For reviews. Let's get into the news! Ooh, welcome everybody to another episode of Fantasy News! I am your disheveled goblin host, Daniel Green, and today we have a nice little even spread of fantasy news to get through. And don't worry, there's no surprise guest hosts or anything like that. This is a totally regular episode of fantasy news. The first story now. The final 2 covers for the new run of The Witcher have been released by Orbit, and I can finally say I no longer have to cover this release, because not only has it been apparently a wildly successful reaction to these covers' artwork online, but they're also really well viewed here in fantasy news. Like, if you look over the stories people jump to, people really want to see these Witcher covers, so here you go. I think they look quite nice, are probably not my favorite Witcher series run ever, but they're good ones. And I can finally stop including these. There's been so many. But if you're looking for a more special edition of a great sci-fi fantasy book, Neverwhere has been announced to be getting the Folio treatment, and that's a tempting one. I actually personally haven't read this Neil Gaiman story, but whenever Folio Society puts out an edition of a book that's like on my TBR, it inevitably just jumps up for no logical reason. I'm not even probably gonna end up getting this Folio edition, but like, I don't know, there's just like, oh, it's got a beautiful edition. I should read the normal one. I hope we get a bit of a Neil Gaiman renaissance, because he's one of those authors that I think, like Stephen King, nearly everything they've written is worthy of an adaptation or very adaptable. I mean, the fact that they were able to pull off Sandman tells me there isn't much that now can't be done in today's day and age. The bigger he gets, the better for the genre as a whole, in my opinion. But if you would like to hear from more authors, there is actually going to be a fantasy convention held digitally September 24th through the 25th called Fantasy Fellowship Con, with authors like Sarah L. Arifi and Adrian Tchaikovsky speaking. And if you want to hear from voices in the genre, this is probably one of the best ways to do it. I'm a big fan of promoting cons like these, and you can sign up if you're interested right in the description down below. And I just want to reiterate, fantasy news is mine now, forevermore. It shall not be used to promote smaller booktube channels or anything like that. This is Goblin.
Daniel. Surely, you didn't think that getting fantasy news back would be that easy, did you? You must
Damn. Oh, sorry about that. Where's my light? Alright, look, you had a guy from New Zealand on here last week. I think it's only fair you let an Aussie have a crack at this. My name is Cam, and while I'm not your disheveled goblin host, I do have what some people describe as hobbit-like feet. A Stormlight Archive adaptation has still not been announced, but in the meantime we do have something pretty cool. Thanks to Brotherwise Games teaming up with Brandon Sanderson's team Dragonsteel, we will be getting 24 miniatures set within the world of Stormlight Archive. So this is actually being done through a Kickstarter, and depending on how well the Kickstarter goes, they might be adding 4 more characters to the previously mentioned 24. I mean, we've all seen how Kickstarters go when Brandon Sanderson gets involved, so it's pretty much a given. The Kickstarter will be coming later this month in September, and while the miniatures will be unpainted and not explicitly made for D&D purposes, it is still a huge deal for Cosmere fans like you and me, even those of you who aren't into miniatures, because these are being described as the first official visualizations of a bunch of characters that we haven't seen like on book covers. Visually, these miniatures will be canon. And another really exciting note there is that Brotherwise Games has said that there is potential in the future for an original game to eventually be added to go along with these miniatures.
Next, fantasy news story.
For all the fantasy gamers out there, we've just been provided a full 10-minute gameplay trailer for the hugely anticipated open-world fantasy game Forspoken. This game's being published by Square Enix, who are responsible for my favorite games of all time, Final Fantasy. And there is a ton to see in these 10 minutes, but I think the biggest takeaways so far, at least in my opinion, is that while a lot of the animation for the NPCs is extremely janky,
But what the hell, boy?
hopefully we get a bit more polish on that, but the world itself is bustin' a big old fantasy I think one of the biggest draws in this game is going to be the magic system. It looks extremely fun. From what we can see, there's going to be a huge arsenal of offensive and defensive spells that you can use, and I think that's great in games like this so that each person who plays it can approach it differently and fine-tune the fights and the combat to their own style of gameplay. Not to mention, moving around the world here has more flavor than a Woolworth's mud cake. Lots of monsters, side quests, collectibles, lore, gear, and weapons to find in this fantasy world. This game could end up being an instant classic, or it could be arse. Time will tell. I'm pretty optimistic, but we'll have to wait until the 23rd of January next year to find out.
Ow! This is mine! Get out of here, Cam! Jesus, rude. Anyway, we're going to continue the coverage with a very heartwarming story that made me feel all fuzzy inside and good. And that's the fact that apparently the ashes of Star Trek legend Nichelle Nichols are going to be sent into deep space. I've seen some people throughout the course of many legends of science fiction getting their ashes sent into space kind of balk at the idea and be like, why is this being done? It seems like a lot of resources, etc. It still just warms my heart, and I've always loved the long history of science fiction eventually resulting in science fact, and there may be no greater example of that than Star Trek, which Lieutenant Uhura, was one of the biggest parts of. And there's a famous story of when Nichelle Nichols was considering leaving Star Trek, Martin Luther King Jr. himself apparently encouraged her to stay on the show, and that's because having her there and breaking the barrier she did in this character has meant a lot for the legacy of sci-fi as a whole. For me though, the sentimentality wins out. I get it won't for everyone though, and it still seems a bit crazy to be shooting ashes into space. I actually looked into how this is being done, and apparently it's a company that specializes in sending people's ashes to space, which I get, yes, seems over the top, but it's just worth it in this case for me. Because if nothing matters enough to kind of go over the top, an Extreme 4, I don't know, it just takes away something beautiful from the world. We're going to continue on from there into some big old Warhammer news. Now, I haven't gotten as far or deep into Warhammer as I really was planning to or like to at this point, so please excuse me talking about this in pretty extreme vagaries because I don't know exactly the context of everything here, but it seems like a rather big deal for my Warhammer 40k crowd. It has been announced that the Horus Heresy is coming to a conclusion with the Siege of Terra. According to a Reddit post posted in the Discord server about the topic, this is one of the longest running series in its own subsection of Warhammer that has ever been in science fiction, composed of over 63 books and 26,881 pages. Started by Dan Abnett, this prequel series is one of the most prominent and important to the long legacy of Warhammer 40k, and I imagine people who have actually managed to read all the books up until this point, this must be what it felt like for me when Memory of Light was coming out. So congratulations. I know the mixture of like glee and sorrow you feel at getting the last book in the series, and I hope I'm covering this somewhat right, because people could also be like, this isn't that big a deal, it's whatever, it's just like the ending of the prequel series, you got a bunch else going on. I don't know. From what I've seen, the Warhammer crowd's excited. From what I'm seeing, doing a little bit more research, it seems the first 3 books are viewed as like the must read, and then you can jump around throughout this series to like fill in a bunch of smaller stories. Warhammer, man, it's so scarily complex, my god. Now in very niche news that I have a lot of surprising feelings about for various reasons, we have gotten the trailer for Blood and Honey. That's right, the horror movie starring Piglet and Winnie the Pooh, because they have gone to public domain and people can do this with their characters now. And this is a great example of why things transitioning into the public domain is important. And I know what you're thinking, Daniel, this looks like a cheap, crappy slasher. What are you talking about? And my response is, Exactly. One of the very important aspects to the development of entertainment is people being able to get their hands on the stories that mattered to them growing up and putting fresh spins on them, possibly even reinventing the character in the popular zeitgeist. Do I think Winnie the Pooh is suddenly going to be thought of forever here and after as a slasher villain? No, probably not. But hey, it could be the future of Winnie the Pooh and totally bring a whole new angle to these adorable little kid characters for the adults who grew up with them. And who am I to say that that's a bad thing? Disney, this will happen to your characters eventually, and I look forward to the day. Does the movie look good? No, but as someone who often enjoys bad slashers for their terribleness, I will definitely be watching this. Speaking of adaptation news though, Cyberpunk Edgerunner has gotten its first not safe for work trailer and an English dub version as well. I'm more and more curious about this because it seems to be so stylized to such a gargantuan extent that it's kind of coming full circle and not hitting me as just over stylized. I will say though, if you have any form of light sensitivity, please take the warning at the beginning of this trailer very seriously. I get headaches from flashing lights, and this was headache-inducing. My biggest concern though from like a Cyberpunk 2077 perspective is it's just so tonally different from the game. But there's 1,000 ways that different tone could be justified within the story, and it does not make me dread going into this in any way, shape, or form. It's just properly preparing me, as a trailer should, for a very different tonal experience from the game, and I actually think the trailer's doing its job in a big way for that reason, so thumbs up for me. Do I necessarily like that tone? Too early to tell. Now, we covered here a while ago on the channel how there is going to be, of course, a Bioshock movie. Well, we finally had a director announced, and that is going to be Francis Lawrence. And I actually think this is really the guy for the job. He's been involved with adaptations before with things like Constantine and Hunger Games. And there's this interesting trend where now that I've looked over his IMDb for even the movies of his I don't necessarily like, I still enjoy the direction of. Like, I didn't love the I Am Legend movie with Will Smith, but I thought it was directed well. Same thing with Constantine. It was a movie that felt very flawed in its script, but I thought the actual visual execution was interesting. But let me know what you think of Francis Lawrence being the director to bring Bioshock to Netflix.
Daniel,
wait,
please,
no,
we're not done. This guy, man, I'm not done yet. Well, I'm sure you're well aware by now that episode 2 of the Game of Thrones prequel named House of the Dragon is out, and much like a suburban dad on a ride-on mower, it is off to a rip-roaring start. The really interesting thing is that while most TV shows' viewerships might drop off a bit after episode 1, you know, people watch it, they decide, it's not really for me. In this case, House of the Dragon's viewership actually went up with episode 2. In the first day or two, more than 10 million people tuned in to watch it, which for comparison's sake is almost 5 times the amount of people that tuned in for the finale of Better Call Saul when it dropped. So obviously the show has already been greenlit for season 2. I don't think anyone was really worried about that not happening, but whether that's a good or a bad thing will depend on how the show goes from here. Personally, I'm loving it so far. I think it's great. I'm not gonna take a cheap shot at, you know, season 8 of Game of Thrones. Everyone's already done that. But the great thing about this show, House of the Dragon, so far is that it feels like diving back into the earlier golden era of Game of Thrones. But even more than that, it feels like the writers are well aware that most of us are already familiar with this world for the most part. So it seems like they haven't had any issue at all in just skipping the foreplay and getting straight to the good stuff, throwing us straight into the conflicts that I'm guessing are going to shape the season going forward. When it comes to shows like this prequel show, or let's say season 2 of The Wheel of Time, I think a huge advantage that the writers have is that they've seen all of the criticism, they've seen all of the stuff that can go wrong. So I would hope, I would have faith that they will use more polish with the show going forward. Whether they do or not, but hey, what do you think? What do you think of this story or any of the other stories that we've talked about today? Scroll down, leave a comment. I personally guarantee that Daniel will read and respond to every single one. My name's Cam, I'm from the YouTube channel Wolf the Story Nomad. I make lots of videos on fantasy books as well, so if you want to pop over and check me out, I would love to have you there. With that said, and jokes aside, I want to give a big thank you to Daniel for having me on this week, and especially to you legends watching this video right now. Thanks for giving me the time of day. So there you go, there's the fantasy news. It flowed, it busted all over you, you're welcome. As a parting gift, I'm gonna wrap this video up with a bit of editing magic. That's what we call it in showbiz.
This has just been your latest episode of Fantasy News. Like and subscribe if you have not already, and hit the Patreon if you'd like to support what I do here. Have a good one, y'all. Peace.